tonight. We've got Edward Alden from the Council on Foreign Relations and former Financial Times Washington Bureau Chief, and Phil Neuenfeldt, the president of the Wisconsin State AFL-CIO. So I think what we're going to do at sort of the speaker's request is, rather than having this be a very formal proceeding from the lectern, we're just going to get in our comfy chairs and have a comfy and enlightening discussion. So with that, I will take my seat and offer the floor to Edward Alden.
So there's one thing I can say with absolute confidence about this issue, and that is that trade has created at least one job, and that's mine. I was hired almost exactly 2 decades ago by a small Washington newsletter called Inside U.S. Trade to cover the minutia of international trade negotiations. And it was a fascinating time to be covering international trade, because I came in the middle of the negotiations for the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, and towards the tail end of the big international Uruguay round negotiations, which resulted in the creation of the WTO. These 2 deals, with the possible exception of the creation of the European Community, these were the 2 biggest trade agreements ever negotiated. So as a reporter, I had a ringside seat to all of this, which was fascinating. I was mostly at the time focused on the details. So I wanted to know, what deals were getting cut in the back rooms, which tariffs were going to be eliminated on which products and how fast, which industries were lobbying for special provisions to benefit their companies, who was winning, who was losing in the trade negotiation. So it was very much sort of covering a negotiation. But in the course of my work there, in the course of covering the subsequent ratification of the NAFTA and the WTO agreements in Congress, and then later as a reporter with the Financial Times following China's entry into the WTO and the negotiation of the various bilateral trade agreements under the Bush administration, I have been thoroughly exposed, I think, as much as anyone, to the arguments by the proponents of free trade agreements and the opponents of free trade agreements. So I mean, to simplify greatly, I would summarize the arguments on either side of the free trade debate as this. For the proponents, they see free trade as a good thing because it will lead to a more sensible international division of labor. United States will be able to specialize, not just the United States, but advanced countries in Europe, Canada, elsewhere, will be able to specialize in more advanced technology-intensive products because we will have a global market into which to sell those goods. And we will import cheaper, more labor-intensive products. Efficiency will go up, productivity will go up, costs for consumer goods will go down, and all of us will be wealthier as a result. So in a nutshell, that's the pro-argument. The argument made by the opponents is that freer trade is likely to be a bad thing for the United States, particularly when it involves countries at lesser stages of development. That what we will get is what's called a race to the bottom. So if you eliminate import tariffs on goods so you can sell from any country into any other country, then corporations are likely to locate their production facilities in places where the costs are lowest, where the protections for workers are the weakest, and where environmental standards are the lowest. And the result of that will be significant job loss for the United States and lower wages for those who remain employed. So, here we are now, basically 2 decades after this debate really got kicked off with the NAFTA. And if you listen to the debates in Washington, you hear more or less the same things. The proponents and opponents of trade are making more or less the same arguments that they made during the NAFTA and the WTO debates. One of the reasons, I suppose, that I left reporting about 5 years ago, now there were a bunch of reasons, most of them personal, but one of the reasons that I left reporting and joined a think tank was my conviction, which in retrospect was probably a naive one, but my conviction that it was possible to look at the evidence and actually come up with a reasonable answer to a question like, has trade been good for jobs in the United States or not? So let me give my best college try to this question. I will start with the short version. Has trade been good for jobs? First, yes, for those working in the 1990s. No, for those working over the past decade. Yes, if you have at least a college education. No, if you don't. Yes, if you work in what we largely call business services industries, so financial services, software, engineering design, that whole suite of sort of high-end services. No, if you work in manufacturing. So I'll go into more detail a bit on each of these three. But I have to start with a slightly depressing caveat. It's actually a lot harder to answer a question like that than you might think. And it's because in the real world, a whole lot of things are going on simultaneously. I mean, we know that trade matters a lot more in the U.S. economy than it used to. In 1970, trade was just 10%. It's imports and exports. Trade was just 10% of the U.S. economy. It didn't have a huge impact on how well our economy did. Today, it's closer to 30%. So much bigger impact on our overall economy. But in 1970, while trade was much lower, we didn't have personal computers. The big container ships that now handle most of the trade from China and elsewhere in the world were just being developed. Much of the world, you think China, Russia, not to mention Vietnam and India, were largely closed to foreign investment, were not part of the global market. And in 1992, when I was covering NAFTA, we didn't have the internet. So sorting out the effects of trade on jobs from the effects of technology on jobs is really hard. I mean, my favorite line from this report, which is the ostensible reason I'm here, I was the co-project director for a big report that the council published at the end of last year on U.S. trade and investment policy. And we had a line in there which was written by my co-director, Matt Slaughter, who's an economist at Dartmouth. And he wrote, suppose that a U.S. multinational company establishes a new affiliate in India to provide internet-enabled back-office accounting support for its U.S. operations. Would the resulting job or wage loss for the company's U.S. workers be attributed to trade, foreign investment, or technological change? The answer seems to be yes, yes, and yes. So to expand a bit on each of these categories, so the 1990s versus the 2000s. The Council on Foreign Relations, where I work, is a nonpartisan organization. This task force report was co-chaired by a Democrat, former Senate leader Tom Daschle, and a Republican, former White House Chief of Staff Andy Card. And the group was more or less evenly split between Republican-leaning former politicians, former Democratic officials, corporate leaders, union leaders, variety of experts. It was a pretty balanced group. And so I see this without any partisan flavor, and it's a conclusion we came to. The last decade has been really, really bad for U.S. workers. I mean, people sometimes ask, are we going to have a lost decade like Japan had? Well, sorry, we've already had it. The Economist just recently examined economic indicators for half a dozen countries that were hard hit by the financial crisis. The worst was Greece, where the Economist says Greece has basically lost a dozen years. Their economy has fallen back 12 years as a result of the financial crisis. Ireland, Portugal, and Spain lost 7 years each. Britain lost 8. The United States, we lost exactly a decade. The number of jobs in the United States right now is roughly the same as it was in the late 1990s, and our population is much bigger. So the question now is not, are we going to have a lost decade? It's whether we're going to have 2 lost decades. If you look in the 1990s, there was robust employment growth in virtually every sector of the U.S. economy and across all education and skill levels. And trade was part of that story, with both exports and imports growing rapidly. CFR did a similar kind of thing, convened a task force on trade in 2001. It was chaired at the time by Bob Rubin, who was the former Treasury Secretary, and Ken Duberstein, who had been Reagan's chief of staff, White House chief of staff in remember his first term or second term. The project director at the time actually was a little-known guy named Tim Geithner. So maybe I have great things in my future. They wrote, which was quite plausible, writing from, this was pre-9/11, 2001, they wrote, quote, "The gains from trade are broadly shared. Throughout the last decade, as the United States has become significantly more open U.S. employment and wages have increased. That was true for that decade written then. 10 years later, the opposite is true. Wages and employment have both declined, and it's not simply a feature of the recession. If you look at the period 2000 to 2009, the only people who made real wage gains in the U.S. economy were the most highly educated. So we're talking PhDs, MBAs, lawyers, and doctors. Everyone else lost ground. If you were a high school grad, your wages dropped on average by 10%. Even college grads lost 5% over the last decade. In the 2000s, companies stopped investing in the United States. We hear a lot in economic debates about the importance of small companies, but like it or not, big multinational companies are really important to the U.S. economy. They account for 60% of U.S. exports, 85% of all research and development, and they pay wages that are on average 25% higher than the U.S. economic average. Most smaller companies that are involved in trade do it as suppliers to the big companies. In the 1990s, these big companies were investing abroad and they were investing in the United States. From 1989 to 1999, U.S. headquartered multinationals created 2.7 million jobs abroad and 4.4 million jobs in the United States. So it was quite reasonable to say there was a kind of win-win going on in the 90s. Now take a look at the period from 1999 to 2009. Those same companies created another 2.4 million jobs abroad. In the United States, they eliminated 2.9 million jobs over that decade. The U.S. stopped attracting foreign investment. At the end of the 90s, more than 40% of all foreign investment was in the United States, an extraordinary figure. By 2009, that had dropped to just over 15%, which was an extraordinary plunge. So if we're going to attribute some of the job and wage gains of the 1990s to trade, it is equally reasonable to attribute some of the wage and job losses over the past decade to trade. In this decade, the big difference on the trade front has probably been China, which entered the WTO in 2001. China is a big economy with an enormous labor pool, and over the past decade, more and more of the world's manufacturing work has gravitated to China. While the percentages are still fairly small, it's enough to have had a pretty big impact. In 1991, for instance, just 3% of U.S. manufacturing imports came from low-income countries. By 2007, so just before the recession, that was 12%, and almost all of that increase was a result of imports from China. So there's no question that even as U.S. consumers have gained from low-priced and often high-quality goods, think iPads and iPhones, which are largely made in China, this has had a significant negative impact on U.S. manufacturing. The most sophisticated study I've seen by an MIT economist, University of California economist, suggests that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the job losses in U.S. manufacturing over the past decade, and that's 5 to 6 million jobs we're talking about, were due to trade with China. So big impact. My second point, trade's been good if you've got at least a college education, not so good if you don't. I hadn't thought this one would be especially controversial, but Rick Santorum seems to have managed to make it so. It's long been a consensus. I think, we want to send our kids to college. College remains the best road for most to higher wages and a more secure life. And this doesn't have to be a liberal arts education. The demand for scientific, engineering, technological talent is exploding. Most manufacturing work, which my co-speaker here knows better than I do, involves sophisticated computerized machinery. And for that, you need at least good technical school training. A lot of manufacturing companies now are saying they can't get enough trained workers for the positions they have open. But high school doesn't cut it anymore. If you live in a wealthy country, in a globalized economy, the only way to get ahead is to develop skills that distinguish you from the hundreds of millions of unskilled, poorly paid people who are more than happy to take your job. And the data, again, over the past several decades bears this out. Again, Matt Slaughter, who worked with me on this task force, has done more work on this than anyone. If you look from the early 70s through the early 90s, only those with college educations or better saw real wage gains in that period. That's a big period, so we're talking 25 years here. 60% of U.S. households had flat or declining wages over that period of rapid trade growth. Things got a little better, as I said, in the 90s, but then fell off a cliff over the last decade. Let's be clear here, just to back up for a second. You cannot look at those numbers and say, well, absolutely, trade has been bad for most U.S. workers. I mean, there are many other factors. There's technology at play, as I talked about. And secondly, for all of us as consumers, and we're both, we're workers and we're consumers, there have been big improvements in quality and big price declines. Most of us live in larger houses than our parents or our grandparents did. Our television sets are bigger and cheaper. We have bigger and better refrigerators. Our cars are relatively less expensive and in most cases more reliable. Economists from the Peterson Institute in Washington have said that the net gains from globalization to an average American family are as much as $10,000. I think that number's probably a bit inflated, but even if it's half that, that's a big number. But almost all of that is on the consumer side. That's a gain that has come from paying less for the goods that we buy in stores. Those are not gains on the wage side. So let me take the last point I made here, which was trade has been a reasonably good thing if you're working in a business services related industry, not so good if you're in manufacturing. It matters a lot in assessing the impact of trade on jobs, which sector you work in. My colleague Michael Spence, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist, the former dean of the Stanford Business School, published last spring, and you can find it on the CFR website, what I think is one of the most important studies produced to date on the issue of trade and jobs. He basically looked at the entire U.S. economy from 1990 to 2008 and divided it up into tradable and non-tradable sectors, which is harder to do than you might think. I mean, some things are obviously tradable. If you're selling cars or you're selling corn, these are things that that are readily tradable. Things like X-ray readings or architectural drawings get more confusing. There's a lot more of the economy now that, due to the internet, is tradable. But anyway, he divided the economy up, tradable, non-tradable, and his conclusion was troubling. He found that virtually all of the jobs growth in the United States over that period came from the non-tradable sectors, so especially government, health services, and before the crash, construction. It was basically no job growth at all in the tradable sectors. And this is worrying for a number of reasons. The tradable sectors are highly productive. Manufacturing in the United States has become enormously more efficient, with computerized machinery doing much of the work that was once done by employees. In comparison, productivity gains in healthcare, government, or basic service jobs like restaurants and tourism are tiny. I mean, the output of our government, our healthcare system doesn't improve markedly from one year to the next. Manufacturing, those improvements have been enormous. So we're ending up with an economy in which a smaller number of people are working in higher wage, higher productivity industries, and a far greater number are working in lower wage, lower productivity service industries. So manufacturing is important for a whole bunch of reasons we can talk about in the Q&A. There are some positive signs of a slight manufacturing recovery, which is important for a state like Wisconsin. It's why President Obama came to the Master Lock plant here a couple of weeks ago. But generally, the story over the last decade has been a pretty depressing one for manufacturing. The big gains in trade for the United States have come in these tradable service sectors, like financial services, software, publishing, telecommunications, higher education, interestingly, which is a tradable service, some health services. The United States actually runs a big trade surplus in services. Last year, our services surplus was $179 billion, which was a record, compared with a deficit in traded goods, which was $737 billion, which sadly is not a record. So what do we do about this? I'm going to stop short here because I want to save some of this for the Q&A. But if you look at the full story in the debate between the opponents and the proponents of freer trade, I would conclude, looking back at the last 2 decades, that each was partly right and partly wrong. I mean, the proponents were right in that there were overall benefits to the economy in terms of improved productivity, falling consumer prices, some of the things they predicted. The opponents were also right that there has been a kind of race to the bottom, especially with respect to jobs and wages for manufacturing workers. So, what's the best response to this? I suppose one response could be to say, stop. We want to get off. This is a game that we're not doing tremendously well in. Why do we want to keep playing? But I don't think, for better or worse, there's any plausible way to do that. The United States has spent much of the last half century trying to persuade the rest of the world of the virtues of capitalism. And guess what? They listened to us. They believed us. And now they're out there trying to outcompete us. And our only choice is to respond by becoming more competitive. And here I'm actually quite critical of U.S. government policy. The U.S. approach to international trade over this period that I've been following for many years was basically to negotiate these agreements that lowered tariffs and eliminated other trade barriers. And the unspoken assumption was that this would be good for Americans because, after all, we were the most competitive economy with the best companies and the best workforce. Well, a lot of other countries didn't take that for granted. The Germans, the Canadians, when they entered into the free trade agreement with the United States in the late 1980s, the Chinese, others, spent a lot of time thinking about how to succeed in this new world, about how to become successful trading nations. And what we argued in this report is that that's what the United States needs now. We need to become a much more successful trading nation. And there are a lot of different elements of doing that, which I'm happy to talk about, but I want to stop now and leave lots of time for questions. But we argue, we need a trade negotiating agenda that plays to our competitive strengths. We need enforcement of trade agreements in ways that prevent harm to U.S. companies and stop unfair trade practices by foreign countries. We need a national investment initiative that seriously tries to attract expanding foreign investment to the United States, because that's something we've been losing out on. And we need a much more sophisticated social safety net and worker retraining program, because the programs we have were designed 60, 70, 80 years ago and don't speak to the realities of a modern competitive global economy. So I'm happy to go into some more detail on some of this, but I want to have a chance to hear from Phil in terms of Wisconsin and what you all are dealing with here. So I'll stop there, Doug, and turn it over.
We like to talk about fair trade. Trade is not a bad thing. We need trade. We need to export goods. Our issue is that we had to have a huge trade deficit. And I know a lot of academics and politicians and policy people like to make this a complicated issue, but it's really not complicated. Think about your own lives, your own checkbook. If you keep paying out more than you take in, what happens? You go broke. If we as a country continue to have record trade deficits, pretty soon we're going to go broke. But we're already kind of in that situation, and I think the trade deficit is at the center of a lot of that and a lot of the reasons for that. So we have to take a look at our commitment in terms of what it's going to take to come back as an economy, and I think trade agreements and solving that trade deficit. I mean, there's a trade deficit. It is bad for America, and we've got to figure out how to fix it and not just talk about it. So we got to start calling that question and holding people accountable around that, because as the saying goes, there's nothing free about free trade. It's costing us jobs, not just in manufacturing, but when a manufacturing plant closes in a community, what happens to that community? What have we seen happen in the neighborhoods of Milwaukee? I don't have to preach to you. When we talk about what's the social cost of this, how many people in this room feel like their futures are going to be far better than what they've seen in the past? How many people feel that your kids or your grandchildren are going to have a better future than you? Just raise your hands. There's one. That's good. But there's a lot that don't feel that way, and I think that's reflective in the arguments about where people really see what's going on. It is not complicated. People get it. Plants are shutting down. Jobs are being lost. The trade deficits are going up. Communities are being blighted. Foreclosures are increasing. Bankruptcies are increasing. What's hard to understand here? 52,000 jobs lost to China alone. We've lost 84,000 jobs since NAFTA took effect. That's a lot of manufacturing jobs, and you've got to remember that when those jobs leave, those companies are investing in other countries. That means that as new products are developed, as new jobs are being created, they are being created in other countries. And so that's a problem when you're trying to solve a trade deficit. So we've got to figure out how we become competitive. There's no question about that. And we like to talk about 4 key principles to be competitive. One is modernization. That's making sure you have the right investments in technology so that you can, get to the right levels of productivity and maximize the use of your production. Part of that is changing the work processes so that workers can participate in that different type of modernized environment. If workers are going to participate and advance their career, there's things that you've got to take a look at. One is you got to have worker education and worker training available so their skills can advance along with the modernization and technology. You've got to have a place for them where they feel like they're partners in a workplace and not just being subjected to the whims of what's going on. For workers to feel like like they're a partner in a workplace, you have to have some sort of independent power source for them to participate in. And from our perspective, of course, that's organized labor. Another thing is, looking at the whole question of the future workers. Where's the skills going to come from? Where are the skilled workers going to come from to participate, not just in what you see now in terms of the technology, but in the technology that's going to happen 5 and 10 years from now. There are people that say that in 5 years, we don't even understand what a lot of the jobs are going to be that are going to be created. That's how fast the technology is going to be. So we've got to make sure that not only do we modernize, change our work processes, give workers protection and participation through an independent power source, but look at the skills and how we're going to build a pipeline of skilled workers coming in. And that's clearly something that they're talking about in Wisconsin that does not exist. There is not a labor shortage. They say there is a skill shortage, so there needs to be investments in the type of training and education. The only way you're really going to have that is you're going to only be able to create some sort of partnership between industry and the community and labor, because you have to have dialogue and you have to have people working together so that if you're going to train and educate people for those jobs, we got to have an idea as to what kind of technology is going to come in place, what type of products are going to be produced, so on and so forth. And that dialogue, I would suggest, does not exist at the proper level that it needs to for Wisconsin to really come out of the economic situation that we're in. And then finally, you can do all these things and still be at a great disadvantage if you don't have some sort of fair trade agreement. And there's a lot of things that get bannered about when you talk about having trade agreements that have worker protection, that have environmental protections in them. Those all sound good and people go along with it. A lot of people are starting to say, what are you talking about with these agreements that have these protections for workers in other countries? Hell, we can't even enforce the laws here in America. How are you going to enforce them in China, India, and other countries? So there's a lot of skepticism about that. So the discussion goes around things like worker content. Wisconsin knows a lot about tariffs. We've seen it recently with the paper industry. Here in Milwaukee, Harley-Davidson, there were tariffs that leveled the playing field. But in other countries, you cannot sell American goods unless a certain percentage of the work performed to manufacture it is performed in that country. And that's not the case here. And that's what adds to the jobs deficit, because even if a company wants to produce in America, they say we can't because of the laws in those other countries. We've had discussions with, I believe, Fireside and some others about this. So we are at a huge disadvantage because of the way that the policies and things are negotiated. And we're basically walking to the table saying, look, you can do what you want with us because, we know that you're going to make us pay and do these. It's a very unfair type of negotiations that are going on. And we need to level the playing field so that if we do these other things, we have a chance to be competitive with the workers around the country, because clearly, you have these issues of standards of living, and I appreciate the fact that TVs are more affordable and some of these things, but think about our standard of living, think about the social impacts that we're seeing, play that out 5 and 10 years from now. No one's going to be able to afford a TV, or fewer people will, even though it costs less. So It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what path we're on, that it's wrong, that we can look to ourselves and do some things, but we are going to need some sort of policy changes to help us level that playing field. So, we talk about worker rights and we talk about rights and, laws that protect us, and you get a lot of pushback on that. But what I find really interesting is if the discussion moves to property rights or intellectual rights, then of course Wall Street and the corporations get really upset because that infringes upon their rights. So, we need some equalization of protecting of rights here, not just around property and intellectual rights, but around worker rights and worker content, so we can start to build things here in America again and do so on a fair table. I have a lot of confidence in the American worker, but we need to have a fair shot at, and that's basically what we're advocating for. So, so thank you for listening to my my rant of all this, and appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, Ted, what about that? If we assume we will put these agreements in place and somehow we can just outcompete everybody and all of that, and it turned out not to be the case because there were the kinds of partnerships between capital and labor and the government in other places that Phil was referencing. So what do we do about it now? I mean, what can be done to have the kinds of changes in the playing field that Phil's talking about?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the challenge is a domestic challenge, and I think Phil mentioned, a number of the items that have to be on any sensible agenda. But I think we have to start thinking as a country about how do we compete more effectively. The fact that we've not been creating jobs in the traded goods sectors. Well, Germans create jobs in the traded goods sectors. They have very strong manufacturing export. They're organized a lot better for it. Some of that's domestic. Some of that has to do with the way unions and companies and governments work together. Some of it is their international push. I mean, the Germans are out there, their political leaders, their embassies, selling German products and doing so quite explicitly and quite energetically. It's a game the U.S. is way behind on, and we're only recently catching up. I think there's long been the sort of feeling that was not an appropriate thing for the U.S. government to be engaged in. There needs to be a systematic effort to think, how do you attract investment to the U.S. and keep it here? And some of this is quite comfortable to labor in terms of working closely with the company. Some of it is less comfortable, and this was a big issue of dispute on our task force. You look at things like the corporate tax rate, which is unfortunately in the United States, I wouldn't claim it's too high by any reasonable standard. Corporations pay a significantly lower share of tax than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. But what's been happening around the world is that countries everywhere have been cutting their corporate tax rates in an effort to attract multinational investment. So we've ended up in a point where our corporate tax rate is relatively high. And so, I think one of the things we need to do is start thinking about, okay, how do we actually make this a good place for multinational companies to invest because we want them here, because they're important for our trade success, and think about what we can do in our tax system to find reasonable ways to balance that out. I'm a proponent, for instance, of a value-added tax, which is rebatable on exports, and it's a great thing for an export economy. It's what the Europeans all do. I'd be in favor of a more progressive income tax to offset some of the regressive effects of the value-added tax, but a lot of this stuff we don't talk about. So it's the competitiveness agenda, I think, is a complicated one, some of which I think is quite comfortable to labor, and I don't think labor has nearly a big enough seat at the table on these issues, but there are parts of it that are definitely less comfortable to labor. Respond to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
I agree with some of those points, but there's some things that you didn't touch on when you talk about Germany and the differences. Yes, Germany has a high-performance work situation. The level of unionization is extremely high, which provides for workers to participate as partners in that, which is the only way we're going to be successful, is if we quit beating each other up and figure out how to empower workers, not intimidate workers. But another very important thing about what's going on in Germany is the difference between the wage of a German machinist and a German CEO is very small compared to the difference between an American worker and an American CEO. Why is that important? Why should we be concerned about it? because it makes a difference on how the leadership of that corporation views the future. The CEO of an American company is concerned about making millions and millions of dollars off of stock bonuses. Those stock bonuses are looked at every 6 months, whereas in Germany and other high-performance industrial companies, the vision, because their salaries are not based on that, or not along that line, the strategic decisions they make about investment and modernization are based on long-term views. And that makes a very big difference in terms of people who look at buying American manufacturing and gutting it out for the tax breaks and the short-term stock exchanges and all the millions of dollars that they walk away from, you know, versus you don't see that in these other cultures, because they are not, they are, you know, there are laws that protect people in the economy in these other countries, and we've got to look at that sort of behavior and bring that up. And you see some of that playing out, although I don't think maybe on that level of discussion. But, you know, what's the Occupy Wall Street about? What's the, you know, this movement that you're seeing sweeping across the country that's talking about Wall Street, the 1% versus 99%? You know, it's all rooted in that, and those decisions play out in how they, you know, view the future and what sort of strategic decisions they make for the future of that company. So that needs to be solved as well.
Well, just to follow up on that, Phil, is there any local example of a company where that is happening, where capital and labor are sort of on the same page?
Well, we just saw a national example happen a couple weeks ago when Barack Obama came to Masterlock, and, you know, the CEO of Masterlock talked about the value of his workers and the important role that labor played and the workers played in revitalizing that workforce and saving it from closing, and in fact allowing them to start to bring work back. So I think that, you know, that's one prime example, but clearly there are others that, you know, we could have discussions about. But there are examples, and regrettably there's a lot of examples of how it plays on the other side as well.
So Ted, what about that? I mean, how do you foster that sort of collaborative approach to it?
I'm not sure I'm the guy to answer that question. I mean, I agree with Phil. I think it's needed. I see examples from around the world where I think it's done better than it is in the United States. But
and what's the difference? I mean, is it?
You know, I'm not sure I've got a really good. I'm not sure I've got a really good answer for it. It's at some level, you know, the union management side is very poisonous in this country. And, you know, on this task force report, where we were, you know, very much kind of working towards consensus, we didn't really go down that road. I mean, at some level, you know, I think we all knew if we went into that issue, there were going to be very sharp ideological divides. And I think it's unfortunate, because I think the larger challenge for us as a country is how to succeed together, because at the end of the day, you know, we're all going to sink or swim. And I, you know, I agree with a lot of what Phil's saying about the need for that sort of cooperation, but it happens too little.
And did we ever have it, Phil? I mean, is this like pie in the sky, or something we could get back to from a happier era?
A happier era?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a provocative question. There's been organizations that have tried things, but the culture has changed. The way that they reward corporations, the way that shareholders and CEOs are rewarded, has just become so emphasized on the short-term decision and the big dollars, that I think that's the type of thing that you got to start talking about. And you know, I don't know. I don't think it was always that way. I'm not that old, so I'm sure at some point it was.